So I'm really excited to start the narrative lectionary, and I'm also a little bit concerned because while I truly and deeply love the Bible, there are parts of it that I struggle with. And this section that we read today, this story of Eve and the serpent in the garden, is one of the stories that I find difficult to deal with. Partly it's that God comes across as this sort of petty dictator making an arbitrary rule about which trees they can and can't eat out of. Partly it's that seems like Eve is punished, as women so often are, for just trying to think for herself and take some initiative. And I can't help but wonder that if this tree was really such a problem, if it was going to cause pain and suffering, then why did God put it in the garden in the first place? In my wrestling with the text this week, I came across some helpful thoughts from Eugene Roop, who wrote the Genesis volume of the Believer's Bible Commentary. He's a Church of the Brethren scholar. And he asserts that thinking of this story in Genesis 3 as the fall, capital F fall, is not a faithful reading of Scripture. He writes that neither the Gospels nor the Old Testament refer to Genesis 3 as the only story about when life becomes permanently distorted. Transgression is not inevitable, but people just keep doing it. And if we look at Scripture, we can see that absolutely this is not the only story where people disobey God. People fall short of God's desires and something bad happens because of it. The story is not unique in that way. And this framing helps me a little bit. It helps me understand Genesis 2 to 3 as one among many stories in Scripture that show people struggling with questions of why. Why isn't life perfect? Why is there conflict between humans and other parts of the natural world? Why does it hurt so much to give birth? Why is it so hard to get food to grow from the ground? Why are relationships so difficult and so often inequitable? Why do we die? The story of Eve is one of the many stories in Scripture that seek to address these questions. Imagine for a moment being in your favorite place, with your favorite people, enjoying your favorite food, with a body that is fully healthy, with no aches and pains anywhere. Paradise. Right? For these ancient storytellers, this perfect life was depicted as the Garden of Eden, a place where animals and humans are friends instead of threats to each other, where food and water simply appear without any effort or work on the part of humans, where humans are equal companions with each other and God just hangs out with them in the cool of the morning in the beautiful garden. The details might vary from person to person about what a perfect life would look like, but we're all in the same situation of recognizing that what real life looks like is not that. There's a gap. There's a gap between what paradise would be for us and what reality is for us. And we want to know why. Maybe you've heard the popular phrase, people often say it when someone manages to mess up something that should have been, that could have been a good thing. And people will say, this is why we can't have nice things. I think this story of the fruit and the snake and Eve and a little bit Adam is an ancient example of this is why we can't have nice things. Because we mess it up. Always. Every time. So Genesis 3 is not the fall, but just a fall. One of many. The story doesn't really tell us why there is sin in the world so much as it confirms the fact that there is sin in the world, and it's a reminder that sin has actual real-world consequences. Okay, but then we bump up against the difficult question of, what is sin? I mean, sure, disobeying God is sin, but since God isn't so much hanging out with us in our gardens these days, or at least not hanging out with us in a way where we hear specific words from God, we're left with a lot of questions, and it can be hard to know, what are the rules? What exactly does it mean to obey God? One implication of the story of Eve seems to be that seeking knowledge of good and evil is sinful, which is really hard for me to accept, because I like to learn things. I like knowledge. Once again, Eugene Roop shed a bit of light on this text for me this week. He notes that when the biblical writers mention the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it doesn't have the moral overtones that phrase has for us today. Scholars aren't 100% sure what's meant here by knowledge of good and evil, but there's pretty strong consensus that it's probably one of two things. It likely means unlimited knowledge, or knowledge that enables someone to control the future. It's not about knowing right from wrong. It's about seeking knowledge that is beyond what is reasonable to expect. It's about wanting to have a type of knowledge that would allow you to control and manipulate other people. I recently came across an article, one of my friends shared it on Facebook, and it was about how many evangelical Christians are buying into this QAnon conspiracy theory, and that the pastors are struggling to know how to address this. And that led me to a podcast where they were interviewing a woman who wrote an article for The Atlantic about QAnon. And for those of you who are fortunate enough to have no idea what that is, here's the basics. It's a conspiracy theory promoted by a person or persons that go by the name Q on some chat room somewhere that I fortunately have never been in. And the heart of the conspiracy is that there's an evil cabal in the world controlling things and doing all sorts of terrible, heinous crimes, including abusing children. And of course, it's run by people in Hollywood and powerful Democrats. The current president of the United States is secretly fighting this cabal and will save us all from its evil grasp. Now, of course, there is literally zero proof for any of these theories. And the messages that Q posts are written in this strange kind of code, so people have to interpret them. And if it turns out that something Q said is wrong, then they can just say they interpreted it wrong. So basically, it can never be wrong, but there's no proof for it. And as fascinated as I was with this whole thing, I had to stop reading about it and listening to podcasts about it, not, as Ryan suggests, because I was starting to believe it. I wasn't. But because honestly, the more I learned, the more depressed I got about humanity. The more disoriented I felt. Like I just don't even understand people anymore. These people who are throwing common sense out the window and believing these ridiculous stories for what? The novelty of something new. For the chance to feel like they're in on some kind of secret wisdom. I mean, what is this world coming to? Right? And then here's the story in the Bible about this woman that listens to a snake because he promises her that she can have some secret knowledge. QAnon conspiracy theory adherents are an obvious example of people who are seeking knowledge in harmful ways. The seduction of the promise of secret access and simplistic answers, but we shouldn't relax into thinking that only people like that are susceptible to this temptation. Get-rich-quick schemes and rapid weight loss programs and bulleted lists of advice abound. Many years ago, I thought I might want to be a freelance writer. And while there are a few very gifted and talented writers, such as our friend Joel Mathis, who managed to make a living writing substantive, helpful things, I found out that most freelance writers have to write articles like 3 Steps to a Great Body, or 5 Things You Can Do Now to Improve Your Relationship, or 4 Simple Ways to Lose Weight. Those are the kinds of articles that most people have to write if they actually want to get paid for their writing. And I didn't want to spend my life writing things like that, so I didn't go down that route. But I will admit, I read those articles sometimes because it's tempting stuff. I mean, who doesn't want to take just one little bite of that magic fruit that will give us all the knowledge? But that, according to the ancient people who passed the story down to their children and their grandchildren, that is sin, somehow. And I think I'm starting to understand a little. In our Wednesday night topic discussion this week, we talked about defunding the police. And while we weren't exactly all in agreement about every aspect of it, we did agree that the police are expected to do too much, too many roles. We agree that we want less violence in our communities. And we agree that there are many, many other issues that we have got to work on to affect this issue, including homelessness, including racism, including the profusion of guns in our society, right? And then in my prayer group on Friday morning, another Mennonite pastor asked for prayers for herself and others who were working on curriculum for Mennonite Church USA around prison abolition and police defunding. And she said that she's been really inspired to learn about the transformative justice movement, the ways that people have found to move away from punitive models of justice towards restorative models to address the root causes of violence rather than just addressing the symptoms. There's a perception, she said, that people who advocate for these kinds of changes, for defund the police and prison abolition, that they're just naive. They're just thinking that we can wave some sort of magic wand and make prisons and police and violence all disappear. But she's learned that the people doing this work, the people who have been doing this work since long before they were buzzwords in the local news, these people know there's not an easy fix. They know there's not one program or one policy or one president that's going to make our systems just and peaceful. But they're doing the work anyway. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil tempts us with a lie, that there's an easy path to wholeness. And this desire for an easy path can steer us away from the good path. The belief in a simple answer can lead us away from the true answer. The grasping for secret knowledge can lead us to double down on our own belief systems and worldviews rather than being willing to learn from others. I'm still not entirely comfortable with this story. I still have questions. But I'm also starting to think that my discomfort and my questions, my wrestling, are maybe signs of my faithfulness. Signs that I'm not accepting the easy answers or expecting some magical knowledge to come down from heaven. I don't need to reach for the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I need to continue reading and praying and listening to God and to others and struggling with the text. And I need to continue appreciating the knowledge that I gain, even as I realize that it never will be, it never can be complete.